Dead bodies aren't the only things dropping from the trees. New updates to now generation consoles, and thanks to Shadow of the Tomb Raider we get another chance to look at this gorgeous looking game, which I covered back at launch on the Xbox consoles or just before. The Foundation engine from Crystal Dynamics is a cracker and it's still a gorgeous looking game, but that's that little bit better thanks to this free next generation update. But what does it do? Well, the first things to take into account is the fact this is not native PS5 or Series X or S console versions. They are still backwards compatibility. They do not change that environment. They're still XDK versions, as you can see here on the Xbox consoles as before. But as I covered before launch, these are updates to the existing engine code to allow them to take advantage of the hardware a little better. Or in the Series S's case, just use it as much as possible. That means that we now target the Xbox One S's code path. This is a BC title, so again, like I say, it's about following the paths you've got. You've got two choices, Xbox One X or Xbox One S. There's not enough grunt here in the Series S and the GPU to hit the Xbox One X levels of performance. That means you get 1600 by 900p as a fixed output resolution. Again, it's at 60 FPS. With the Pro version targeting 3328 by 1872 with checkerboarding to create that image. Very good solution, it works brilliantly here and it looks much better and much cleaner than anything you're seeing on the Series S, as you can obviously see, but it does target half the refresh rate. But even when you jump to the frame rate mode on the Pro, that's still targeting 44% higher output image quality at now 1920 by 1080. Again, no checkerboarding here, it's fixed, and as I zoom in here you'll see all those high frequency details of the dagger, the textures, the assets, even the tress effects on Lara's hair. All of that looks much softer, and it does now target the same performance metric, but in this case the Series S is better. But as you would expect, it's pushing a lot less pixels. So unfortunately the Series S is a bit of a letdown in terms of a next generation console, because it doesn't feel anything but a last generation console. It has less options, worse image quality, and overall the only benefit here is you have much better performance than you do on the Pro and even on the Xbox One X, but not as big a gap there. There's no tearing, which is a big benefit, but there are still dips occasionally, but they're not that bad. But I'll get to performance in a moment. Overall, the image quality between the two is a shame, because like I say, it does stand out that the Pro looks better in both modes, even if it doesn't perform better. And this carries over again if you've got the Series X. The image quality delta here on the foliage, long distances, all that high frequency element of detail image is completely lost. The TAA obviously softens it. The less information you've got per pixel, then the more the TAA will affect that image quality. Here, with a very close to 4K on the Series X, it looks much sharper, much cleaner, and much better overall on a 4K screen. There is absolutely no doubting here that this title is sub 1080p as soon as you turn it on. You do get used to it, you do get accustomed to it, but overall I would still recommend the Xbox One X version and the Pro version over this. Maybe not the Pro version in terms of performance in the 60 FPS mode, but the fact you've got the choice, it's still better in my opinion, because you can pick your poison, frame rate or resolution. So moving over to the bigger boys then in the Series X and the PS5, it's a similar situation in the sense of we now have both options still in the menu, but they don't do anything, or at least they don't do anything on the Series X. Flicking between frame rate and resolution gives you exactly the same output, and that means on the Series X we now get 3584 by 2016. No checkerboarding visible here. It looks like a native solution, and it works well. It looks sharp, it looks clean, it looks very good overall, and I think it's almost the same as what we saw on the Xbox One X. It was definitely just under 4K on that version when I covered it back then. But this is in contrast to the PS5, which targets the same checkerboarded solution that we see in the resolution mode on the Pro, but that's now up to 3840 by 2160 because it has the horsepower to do it. And that means you get 14% increase in resolution throughput on the PS5 over the Series X, but it uses checkerboard rendering to get there. But the checkerboard rendering solution here is much, much better. I covered this on my Marvel's Avengers. That's a terrible implementation on the PS5 and makes the image quality look much, much worse. But here, it's better. There is a subtle difference with that checkerboarding solution, highlighting things like dithering on alpha effects, certainly the tress effects on Lara's hair. You can see it here as I slow it down and move. The only other subtle change is a slightly darker gamma output on the PS5, and that's standard, and some flickering light maps and shadow map issues on the Series X. Didn't see them on the other consoles, not saying they don't appear, but they certainly happen often on the Series X for me to notice it. But aside this kind of zoomed in, detailed slowdown analysis, you're never going to notice it, just like the texture resolution difference and the pixel count difference. Side by side on the same screen on 4K, these two consoles look identical. And it really, brings me back to the point of resolution is irrelevant beyond a certain point. And the checkerboard solution here is one of the best, certainly up there with Horizon from Guerrilla and God of War from Sony Santa Monica. So I'll hope to see more and more solutions, implement that checkerboard or other elements of reconstruction elements that are getting better this generation to try and utilize the power a little better. And it all pays off in terms of performance, which I'll get to in a moment. But the last part we can discuss is loading. Again, because it's a backwards compatibility title, I'll compare the PS5 and the Series X between them, both running on their internal SSDs. And as you can see, it's much, much faster on the Series X because it can utilize that backwards compatibility a little more in terms of the performance. It's limited on the PS5, as I alluded to when the consoles came out. It's got a limited profile to use. That means that memory's reduced, bandwidth can be reduced, certainly GPU and CPU core frequencies could be reduced as well. Basically 100% slower load times on the PS5 to the Series X. It's much faster than it was on the last generation versions, absolutely, but it's still pretty slow, and it's nothing like modern titles that would take advantage of it. So again, it's a nice boost on the Series X, much better on the Series X and the Series S, because you now jump into load times much, much faster. And that brings us into performance. And this is where it's quite interesting. So again, comparing the Pro to the PS5, it's a huge delta. Look at one section here at the beginning, which is very, very stressful. It's constantly in the 30s and 40s, but more importantly, the frame time is all over the place. Look at the frame graph at the bottom. It's going from 16 milliseconds right up to 50 or even 80 milliseconds at some point, and it feels horrible, juddery and stuttery. And that means it's a very bad title to play at this point. It's not always like this. There are much smoother elements, but if you're in combat and attacking or exploring very dense areas of jungle, it can certainly dip. And it can also dip a little more often than not in the cutscenes. But again, they're not interactive, so it's not quite as bad. Flipping this over to the Series S and comparing the Pro to that, you can see the difference that we're talking about. So just as before, the resolution is obviously much, much worse, but the performance is much, much better. In fact, it's almost a locked 60 FPS. You still get jitters when you jump between certain cutscenes from one shot to the next, when assets and physics and all those kind of things load back in. And this can happen in combat as well when you go to attack somebody, but this is exactly the same as it was in the last generation version. You can't inherently fix things within the engine, so you get these held frames that try and stop that happening. So you can see spikes of 50 milliseconds when you attack somebody and go into that death kill animation routine. But outside of that, in combat, it can drop a few frames here and there when it's fill rate limited in terms of bloom, depth of field, lots of alpha effects on screen. All of those effects can impact the Series S a little more. But overall, it's the best performing of all the consoles here. Much, much better than the PS4 Pro, and I'll wrap that up in a moment at the end. So overall, it's a great performing title, even if it's not the best looking one on the Series S. Moving over to the Series X and the PS5, they start off very close indeed, and overall they're not that far apart, but one is certainly better than the other. And that's in the PS5's favour. Unsurprisingly, that checkerboard solution, which we've just covered on the image quality, also pays dividends in terms of performance. By reducing that pixel fill rate and bandwidth cost, it thereby gets better performance out of the hardware. And we see this at certain sections in the title that are fill rate limited. Lots of alpha effects, explosions, general play like the heavy section here with lots of characters, geometry, shadow maps, or light sources, all of that, they run perfectly. The same jitters we see jumping between frames happen again. Those kill animations animations, all of that is still consistent on all versions. They can flip-flop sometimes, 50 milliseconds, sometimes 80 milliseconds. They just flip-flop as they go along. It generally is not something you pick up in cutscenes or in those combat sections. But overall performance is quite solid, but once we get into the combat section, what we can see here is the performance on the Series X can dip more often than the PS5. They drop a few frames every now and then in heavy combat, but if the PS5 is dipping, the Xbox Series X is dipping more. This early combat section here is a good example. You can see that some of these heavy areas with the characters shooting at you, lots of alpha, lots of light sources, shadow maps, all of this can cause the Series X to dip, occasionally into that 33 millisecond point. It's not often, it doesn't feel that bad, and it's very, very brief. But when you get to this open kill room section here where everyone's running in, you can cause stress sections. Now let me be clear, this isn't how you play Tomb Raider. I'm trying to stress the engine and the machines, that's the point of this. If you're running gung-ho like Rambo and shoot everything and blow everything up, then you can cause these dips. And on the Xbox Series X we can get down to 44 FPS by doing this. Now I did notice looking at this that I didn't jump out on the PS5, so I did go back and retest it again on the PS5, copying this and actually swamping it more, getting explosions right in my face as you can see here. And again it can drop to 58 FPS, couple of dips, 5 drops in fact in the same section, easily as heavy as what I covered on the Series X. And then if we go into this pre-scripted cutscene here, the QTE sections in the title that they use occasionally, you can see that the fill rate area with all this water swamping the screen, it can drop the Series X to 44 FPS and the PS5 is at 50 at the exact same point. And overall, like I say, these are the worst stress sections. Do not take this as indicative of the title. General in play throughout the title, it's rock solid 60 on both. It's very, very minor. I'm trying to stress it here. That's the point of these kind of tests. So this side-by-side analysis shows, as you can see here, top of the stack is the Series S at the top, and then it goes down to the PS4 Pro. Even that, you can see the average is 54.6. So it's still a 60 FPS title through and through. Generally, it's a very good and beautiful looking title. It's just now the best of both patch on the Series X and PS5. You get the resolution image quality pretty much of what the Xbox One and PS4 Pro were, but you get the performance, that 1080p mode merged into one beautiful free package, which now gives you a better option to dive back into Shadow of the Tomb Raider again if you have already played it, or pick it up now cheaply, or go and buy it second hand, more importantly second hand from the store, or go and buy it brand new from the store on deals. Physical copies are the most important thing. If you can get it, buy it, play it. It's the best of the modern Laras in my opinion, because it captures that essence of that adventure and the exploration and the secret tombs that Tomb Raider was always famous for. The modern Lara is not a nice Lara. She's not a nice person, everyone knows that. She's not a great character at all. It's not the best version of Lara, but this one certainly captures that, and it's certainly the best looking version of Lara Croft we have seen. Anyway, if you do like what I do here, remember I am completely self-funded and independent, so any help you can give me by supporting me on my Patreon link below, subscribe to the channel, get my numbers up, share this video where appropriate, and also comment and like down below, because that really helps the algorithm and get me more views on YouTube. All of those things really, really help more than you can possibly imagine, so if you can, please do those, some or all. I really do appreciate it. Anyway, this would be the point where I make a reference to the film or game. Is it stay away from her, you b***? Or if it bleeds, we can kill it. You decide. I'll catch you on the next one.